Hello and welcome to a new episode of Is Your Quarantine with Literature. Today we're talking about Shakespeare in Love, and we will use this film to talk about the Elizabethan Theatre and Romeo and Juliet. The film Shakespeare in Love got out in 1998 from the direction of John Madden, and it was written by Mark Norman and Tom Stoppard, and it counts a wonderful cast. Joseph Fiennes as Shakespeare. He also played Lord Dudley in Elizabeth, Luther in Luther, and Bassanio in The Merchant of Venice. Gwyneth Paltrow as Lady Viola. She played also Helen is Sliding Doors, Donna Jensen in View from the Top, and Pepper Potts in Iron Man. Geoffrey Rush has Philip Henslowe. He is our beloved Barbossa in the Pirates of the Caribbean, Lionel Logue in The King's Speech, and Sir Francis Walsingham in Elizabeth. Colin Firth as Lord Wessex. He also plays Mark Darcy in Bridget Jones' Diary, Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, and King George VI in The King's Speech. Ben Affleck as Nate Allen. He plays Matt Murdock in Daredevil, Bruce Wayne, Batman in Batman vs Superman, and Rafe McCauley in Pearl Harbor. And last but not least, Judi Dench as Queen Elizabeth I. She also played Queen Victoria in Mrs. Brown, M in every James Bond film, and Armand in Chocolat. The film is an imaginary story of how Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet, and we're going to use it today to explain the play and the famous Elizabethan Theatre. With the name Elizabethan Theatre, we mean the theatre production that England saw under three different sovereigns. Elizabeth I, from 1558 up to 1603, James I of England, from 1603 up to 1625, and Charles I, from 1625 to 1649. The terms refers to all the characteristics that remain the same under their kingdom. So what are the characteristics of the Elizabethan Theatre? First, there is a bond with local Middle Age despite the modernities of the play. All the various scenes in the duel that you see in the film, in reality and in the play, well represented these characteristics. Second, there are no Aristotelian unities. Aristotle claimed that every play should respect the unities of time, space, and action. Unity of action. The tragedy should have only one principal action. Unity of time. The action of the tragedy should occur in a period of no more than 24 hours. And unity of place. The tragedy should develop in one physical location. When we see Henslowe and Shakespeare talk about the possible plot of the piece that is yet to come, they wander with their imagination among exotic places, shipwrecks, pirates, so they are clearly not concerned about all these classical canons. The aspect of fusion of tragic and comic was a typical characteristic of the Elizabethan theatre, though Aristotle clearly stated that the two genders must not be mixed. In England, it's more of a technique than an aspect, as it was used to entertain the audience. This was mostly made by peasants and people from the working class rather than nobles. The Master of the Revels, played in the film by Simon Callow, is a figure that really existed and is the symbol of what the theatre indeed experienced about difficulties and troubles with the law. As it is. At the half of the 16th century, there was a stiffening in control over theatre and theatre production. In fact, in 1543, a new political authority was instituted, the Master of the Revel, who had the task to control and regulate the mise-en-scène. As portrayed in the film, women could not act, and the role of women was played by men. In 1572, the Act for Punishment of the Vagabonds was issued. It punished all fencers, bear-words, common players of interludes and minstrels not belonging to a baron of this realm. So professions like actors and playwrights was extremely risky if you were baronless. In 1574, there was a census of all the companies of actors in London, so people could not claim to be actors unless they were part of a company. The priest shouting against the theatre in the film is a figure that reminds to the final closure of theatre from the Puritans in 1642. At the end of the 16th century, all the plays were banned from the city and they were exiled at the Bankside district, the part of London that was considered less respectable. The Rose Theatre and the Swan Theatre, both mentioned in the film, were actually in the Bankside district. In the film, we see Richard Burbage, played by Martin Clunes, talking about his father, James Burbage. Now, James Burbage has indeed built in 1576 the first theatre public that was called the Theatre. There were two types of theatre, public and private at the time. So public theatres, also called the Wooden O, were open to anyone. The centre part of it was roofless and people could not see it but could be directly under the stage. This part were for the poorer people, while the balconies, covered with a roof, was reserved for the higher classes. The ticket for this place cost more and they could also rent a cushion for £1. We can see all of this in the film, from the actors' rehearsal to the mise-en-scène of the play. Private theatres were a rather smaller place than the public ones. They were indoors and had a better possibility of setting up a good and spectacular scenography. They used to have a quieter audience and were normally just for the sovereign, i.e. the king or the queen. We can see a small example of it in the scene when we see the queen for the first time. Later, during the reign of James, the king might also participate to the play as a saviour. Shakespeare wasn't obviously the only Elizabethan playwright at the time, and in the film we see more of them. We also see Christopher Keith Marlowe, who wrote plays in the period between 1564 up to 1593. Marlowe wrote The Jew of Malta, Tamburlaine the Grey, Dido, and The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus, that was written 7 years before Romeo and Juliet, and in the film we see Shakespeare struggling with the fame that Marlowe, played by Rupert Everett, and his Faustus have. However, in the film they are more portrayed as friends that share the difficulties of being a playwright more than competitors. In the film, we see another playwright, still as a young kid, John Webster. John Webster is a post-Shakespearean playwright who wrote tragedies, particularly focused on female characters. So when in the film he says to the Queen, "I like the part where she stabbed herself," we are seeing a young Webster that already had a passion for gruesome scene in his early years. In the film, Shakespeare is continuously asked for comedies. That is true. Tragedy in the theatre started to appear more or less after the death of Queen Elizabeth I, where England in general experienced a crisis of value. In fact, another feature that made the Elizabethan theatre so popular was that playwrights wrote about existing issues that all the audience could share and understand. The end of the Elizabethan period corresponds more or less to the 1642, when Puritans closed the theatre because they used to attract a rough and uncouth audience and because shows were hands on Sunday, a day where people were supposed to go to church and pray God and not enjoying themselves in the theatre. King Charles II will reopen the theatre in 1660, and that is called the period of restoration of theatre.